So we're back, and this is episode 10 of Footnotes. Footnotes in what?
In Valley History.
Footnotes in
Valley History.
Got Nancy, and Nancy's been busy this week because Nancy went on vacation, and when she was on vacation, she found out what?
I found out that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is now history.
It's now history.
Part of history.
And you were kind of the Lower Valley rep, or what were you the
Upper Valley? Upper Valley. We're Upper Valley.
Oh yeah, Upper Valley.
I was the Augusta County coordinator in leading our little part of the fight for this. This was a cast of thousands that worked on this for 6 years. I first heard about this in 2014, in May of 2014, and very quickly sat around a table in southern Augusta County with some other people, and we decided this probably wasn't a good thing for Augusta County, and we've been working on it ever since. So now we can write the history of how America's biggest corporate bully got taken down.
See, and you told me once that the key to this was making it last as long as you could, and that's what happened, basically, right?
That's right. We ran the clock on them. It was time and obstacles. We sat down with somebody who shall remain nameless, but was giving us some advice early on. It was an elected official who couldn't come out really publicly against this, but didn't like it any more than we did. And he said time and obstacles. And so that's what we did. We ran the clock. And we also, our strategy was death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one big blow that's going to take them out, but that we would keep working on it, and hit them at every place where we knew that it was wrong what they were doing, and that's what we did. And eventually, death by 1,000 cuts worked. We lost a lot of battles, and we won the war.
Cool, good. And you got to go to the Supreme Court.
We went to the Supreme Court. That's right.
You got to go to the Supreme Court, which a lot of people do not get to do.
I know. Wait in line for that, and I was one of only. I mean, there are a lot of people that go in, all the lawyers and all the friends of the justices and the media and all that. But then they take. In this case, they took I think 48 people from the public who had stood in line all night, and I got to be one of them. And it was really one of those thrills of a lifetime kind of thing to see the highest court in the land.
History makes a dream.
Right. Part of our Constitution. And although we did lose that case, just to think that we took this fight all the way to the Supreme Court and won things from the top to the bottom. So it was all about those little one-on-one fights on people's land all the way up to the Supreme Court. And like I said, it was a cast of thousands. There wasn't 1,000 cuts, 1,000 and thousands of people. And if there's a silver lining, it's that I think a lot of us now realize how important our world is. This wonderful Shenandoah Valley, our farm families, our heritage, all of that was going to be destroyed, our drinking water, and the good friends that we've met along the 600 miles of the route. There's a farmer in North Carolina that I've talked to him on the phone a lot of times, Marvin, but I haven't ever met him, and my goal now is to go meet him, and became good friends with some of the yogis from Yogaville in Buckingham County, and also some of the African-American leaders from Union Hill in Buckingham County. So people that I never would have probably crossed paths with, I now feel a kinship with.
Oh, I want Marvin and the Yogis to meet.
Marvin and the Yogis. That sounds like a band, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it was a cartoon or something like that.
But I mean, the Yogis and the Southern Baptists, the African American Baptists from Union Hill are now on the same team and all work together. So it's really cool what it did to bring people together and to know that history was on our side and that we were ultimately right. And the things it's just gratifying to think of the things that we've saved and protected for our future generations.
Yeah. Anyway, congratulations.
Thanks.
And today we're going to do Augusta County's beginning. So last time we did Christmas in July, and then today is Augusta County's beginnings. And how and I'm fortunate to have done a play with Max Swift, and you were a part of this, starting this up called The Spirit of Augusta. So I kind of know a lot about the beginnings, but you know more, still know more, and I've written a whole play about it. Anyway, at least a bunch of songs. So what? Tell me about the beginnings of Augusta County.
Well, really to go back to the real beginnings, and a lot of this was uncovered in the pipeline work, because part of what they were forced to do is historic and cultural resources surveys, and in that they kind of confirmed what we knew, that there were these amazing Native American resources that were here that date back in the Shenandoah Valley for 10,000 years. So really, Augusta County's beginnings go back 10,000 years to the first Native Americans who were here. And then the Native Americans were here up until about 1700. And then for a variety of reasons, some internal reasons with the other Native American groups in this country, as you go east and west, for some merging and conflicting with them, but also mostly because of an impending collision between the settlement that is happening in Eastern Virginia, starting in 1607 with Jamestown, and moving increasingly west, was putting pressure on all those native peoples who had settled all the way up to the Chesapeake Bay. And they were being pushed out and being, wiped off the face of the earth in many cases, just by our settlement. And then you had a lot of settlement by the French, not necessarily settlement, but fur trade in the Ohio River Valley and then beyond there, of different tribes, and that the fur trade was becoming very lucrative there, and they were kind of moving from west to east, and that the pinch point essentially was the Shenandoah Valley. So the Native Americans who were here for 10,000 years essentially moved out. Some of them moved west into the Allegheny Mountains. Some of them moved south into the Cherokee area and down in there. But one reason that the Shenandoah Valley opened up and settled so quickly and so easily was the fact that there were no Native Americans to bump up against and have conflict with. So, but that doesn't mean that they weren't here, and they weren't the first settlers. And they were probably, most of the ones who were here for those 10,000 years developed into a sort of a Sioux, S-I-O-U-X,
Okay.
tribal people who spoke the Siouan language. They were agriculturalists. They grew corn and pumpkins and beans and things like that, and also harvested things from the wild and then hunted. So they were hunter-gatherers as well as beginning agriculturalists.
Can
And
you
they
think
have
of a few things that they would have grown that were introduced to the English, Scotch, Germans, whoever came here, that weren't over in Europe?
Well, certainly corn. Corn is the number one thing. It was called, our early settlers would have called it Indian maize.
Okay.
Or Indian corn. And certainly corn is the primary crop. That is our primary crop today, figures into our whiskey and talk that we did and everything else. But that's a Native American crop. Okay. Absolutely. And so are pumpkins and gourds and things like that. I'm trying to think. Tomatoes are actually a South American crop that came up into this area. Tobacco, of course. Tobacco was the Native American plant was crossed with John Rolfe developed a plant that then turned into our cultivated tobacco. Okay. But tobacco is a New World crop. So a lot of that, potatoes actually did some reverse migration. We think about the Irish.
Yeah, I was thinking, the Irish.
The Irish and the Germans being connected, especially the Irish potato famine being connected with potatoes. Potatoes was actually a New World product that was early on reverse migrated back to Ireland and very quickly caught on there too. So anyway, we're a cultural mishmash now.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if like the South Americans came over, found tomatoes in South America, or whoever came to South America and found tomatoes.
Right.
And then they sent them back to Italy for the pizza. So now I want to do a whole show on the history of the pizza, because if there was no tomato on the pizza,
well, right. And think about potatoes and how important potatoes are in German cooking and Irish. The whole
right.
Irish potato famine was wrapped up in that. So there's a whole lot more than just the people coming over. There's a book about the seeds, the plants that were reverse migrated. Remember when I was telling you about the cattle, and the first cattle that came here, because there weren't cattle in North America, didn't thrive until the seeds on their coats and all were introduced here, so that we have American plants. So if you drive around right now in the Shenandoah Valley, when you drive around the roadsides, you'll see Queen Anne's lace blooming and chicory blooming, and it's really beautiful, that blue and white together. Those came from Europe and were introduced here. Those are both introduced plants. So anyway, it's sometimes very hard to separate what was here and what came here. The honeybee was introduced here. The honeybee wasn't a native pollinator.
Okay.
And in fact, those Native Americans often said they knew when settlement was approaching, because the honeybees, which were brought over from Europe, very important pollinators, when the honeybees, wild swarms, started appearing, that they knew that the settlement was not far behind.
Okay.
So essentially, by 1700, the Shenandoah Valley was a travel way, what we call Route 11 today.
Like the Wilderness Road.
Yeah, that was actually called, also the Warrior's Path, and it was the path that connected any Native American trading and hunting back and forth between the Carolinas and Kentucky and up into Pennsylvania and West Virginia. So it was there, and it was an relatively easy, way to get from Pennsylvania to here. So you have this empty valley. You have a lot of English, mostly English settlement that has moved from Jamestown and Williamsburg area, the historic triangle, west until they're bumping up, on the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Piedmont is settled out what's now Albemarle, and that was the Wild West at one time, okay, about 1700, and then people started looking over to the other side of the mountain
to the Blue Mountains.
Over across the Blue Mountains, right?
Yeah, because they look blue.
They look blue, and that's from, more than likely, scientists tell us that is from the fumes that come off the pine trees that give it a kind of a blue haze.
Okay.
And so the Blue Ridge Mountains are actually some of the oldest geologic formations in the world. That's why they're so smooth and worn. When you get to the other side of the valley, you get the Alleghenies. Those are some of the youngest mountains in the world. Okay. Or not as young as the Rockies, but the Blue Ridge once looked like the Rockies.
Okay.
Millions of years ago, but they got worn down by time. So you have settlement in Virginia that has bumped up to the mountains, and you have settlement in Pennsylvania. Think about in the Philadelphia, Lancaster County area, settlement in Pennsylvania that has started spreading west. If you look at those Blue Ridge Mountains, and those Allegheny Mountains, they're both on a map, kind of tilted like this, sort of northeast, right, and they just open up like a giant funnel to that southeastern Pennsylvania area.
Right.
So if you're moving, west, and you're only and the roads aren't developed enough to have a wagon, so you're on foot for the most part. Is it easier to go over a mountain, or is it easier to follow a river and go along a valley? Well, the answer is, of course, valley. So, but people in Eastern Virginia were kind of looking over into what they called a black, dark wilderness with an eye toward perhaps moving there and making some money. And so that one of the first official explorers, there were a couple of German guys and Swiss guys who had explored and mapped into the valley, especially up in the northern part of the valley in the Harpers Ferry area, and maybe down into as far as Harrisonburg, in the late 1600s. And they had actually seen in the late 1600s a few Native American villages, which
Right.
were then soon to disappear. But then you have Governor Alexander Spotswood, who wants to find out what's over on the other side of the mountain, mostly not to explore it, but to look for mineral wealth. He had a great big iron works in what's now Spotsylvania County, of course, named after him. And he had called Germanna.
Yeah, which is near Fredericksburg. Yeah.
Right. And it was called Germanna because he brought a lot of Germans in there to help with his ironworks. Anyway, he formed a group of gentlemen, and they gathered up some Native American guides, some military people, and some scouts, and they just went up the slopes of the mountains.
You left out the liquor.
Well, and they also packed a lot of alcohol.
Yeah.
So, and that's very important, as you'll see. So they go up the slopes of the mountains, probably around where 33 cuts through the mountains around at Massanutten, through the gap there, Swift Run Gap. Probably there, although there are some historians who say it wasn't exactly there, but history tells us it's most likely that that's where they came over the mountains, had to chop their way up, chop up with axes, and you have mountain laurel that's this thick around, and vines, greenbrier, and giant rattlesnakes and things. So they get up the mountain and they get to the top, and they name the biggest mountains that they see: Mount Spotswood and Mount George for King George of England, because these are Englishmen. And then they fire some volleys and drink a lot of toasts. They fired a volley, toasted the king, drank some liquor, and they had 15 different kinds of liquor, and they just kept firing volleys, and then they named what we call the Shenandoah River. Right where from there they can see what is the South Fork of the Shenandoah River flowing north, because the Shenandoah River flows north, and they named it. You know what it is? They named it
the Euphrates.
The Euphrates. That's right. And the Euphrates River.
One of the dumbest songs I ever wrote. I was wondering, is all this stuff really true? And it was.
Yeah. They named it the Euphrates River. They wrote out on a piece of paper and claimed the whole valley for King George of England. They buried it in a bottle somewhere that's never been found. Drank some more toast, and then they left. And Spotswood called those guys his Knights of the Golden Horseshoe, and he apparently made a little pin with little jewels in it, and that was shaped like a horseshoe, and gave it to all of them. So that was
the late 16s.
Yeah. So that was it. Then they went back and said, we ought to settle there and maybe make some money. So in the meantime, you've got the French and the Native Americans sort of putting a lot of pressure on sort of everywhere from the West with this fur trade, and threatening to come in and settle, or maybe have some incursions over the mountains into these settlements. And so the powers that be in Eastern Virginia said, it would be nice if we got some settlers into the valley to give us a good buffer between us and the French and the Indians, give us a little protection, and it's all right if they make a little money too. So, but we don't necessarily want to stick our neck out and go out there. So what do? In the meantime, and I should say, this is very important, in Virginia, prior to the Revolution, Virginia was a church state. In other words, there was no separation of church and state. Right. So everybody technically had to be Anglican, which we call Episcopalian today, but they had to be Anglican because the English
Church of England.
Yeah, the Church of England. And so if you lived in the colony, the church was part of the government. And so you had a county line and you had a parish line, and everybody had to go to church, and you got fined if you didn't go to church. And the church vestry, which is the governing body of the church, was also part of the local government. And so when you created a new county, You had to build a courthouse. That seems pretty familiar to us. You also had to build a church, an Anglican church, and you had to elect a sheriff, and you had to have justices who are sort of like our board of supervisors today,
Right.
And you had to have a vestry,
The church council,
which today is just your church council. But back then, the vestry the vestry had the power of the purse. They taxed you. They walked your lands and figured up how much land you had and then how much you should be taxed per acre. And they took care of, so the justices took care of the criminal stuff. So if you stole something, the justices are going to hear about it and decide what's going to happen to you. But if you were drunk in public or swore or had a child out of wedlock or didn't go to church, the vestry took care of it because they were sort of the moral police. And
didn't they also, like, if you had to adopt a child, or if a child was, they had to.
Right. They were also like the welfare department.
Yeah, they were social services also.
They were social services, exactly right. So if you had someone who was indigent, who was so poor they couldn't make a living, then that person would have been taken care of, maybe in the poorhouse that they also helped run, or bound out. If there was a young orphan or a young poor child, they were bound out to someone, which means if it was a boy, it's like maybe bound out to a blacksmith, and then he's basically becomes an indentured servant to that blacksmith for a certain number of years. The blacksmith teaches him the trade, feeds him, clothes him, has a place for him to sleep, teaches him to, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and that person becomes a servant to the blacksmith until he turns 21 in many cases. If he was African American and free, they had to stay into servitude longer. Okay. So right from the very beginning, this was a unjust system. So
question, was the parish line, because the parish line is kind of the vestry, the church line, and the county line always the same?
No.
Okay.
Not east of the Blue Ridge. East of the Blue Ridge, because it sort of evolved slowly over time. First there were shires in Virginia, and then the shires became counties, and where churches were built, then they kind of drew the parish lines, and the county lines did not match up.
Okay.
West of the Blue Ridge. So once they made this decision to do some settlement west of the Blue Ridge, so that would be Augusta County, for instance, the laws changed, because by that time they had it all codified. They knew exactly what they had to do. They had been figuring it out for 125 years, 130 years.
So once they crossed the Blue Mountains, as we say, it basically was kind of like they had a pre-planned city.
Once they crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains, they said, okay, we know how to do settlement now, and what we're going to do. And so once they crossed it, so and this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but once they crossed the Blue Ridge, once there was enough population there to create new counties, they did the lines contiguous. So Augusta County Parish line was the same as the Augusta County line. Yeah. So they were one and the same.
Which is a much bigger line than it is now.
Right. So what happens is, so let me fill in the blanks there. So they were saying, hey, we need someone to come be a buffer for us, but we in the East, we settled Englishmen. We don't really feel like going out there and dying. Yeah. It's just not our thing. We're on these nice settled plantations, and so they started looking to bring in other settlers. Up in Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania colonies developed differently. Pennsylvania had total freedom of religion. William Penn settled Pennsylvania with the idea of making it a haven for people who were dissenting from the established Church of England or the Catholic Church or whatever. But so everybody was welcome in Pennsylvania, and so a lot of people who were discriminated against because they weren't Anglican settled in Pennsylvania early on, especially the Presbyterians from the north of Ireland, who were from a region called Ulster, who originally were from Scotland and were Presbyterian in Scotland, where Presbyterian was the established religion, had moved to Ireland at the bequest of the British who wanted them to settle there and sort of make settlement and create some stability in the north of Ireland, and also because they were linen makers. They grew flax and made linen. So these people were Presbyterian in an Anglican world there, and they didn't like it because they were discriminated against economically. They could never own land. They couldn't get the schooling they wanted. They could never move up in the world. So they were eager to move to Pennsylvania, where everything was cool. They could build their own churches. They could have their schools. They could own land, and they could make a lot of money.
I'm just thinking, you got the Church of the Brethren, which were the Dunkers. You got the Mennonites.
Right. Yeah. So you had a whole bunch of Presbyterians who were English speaking, and then you also had all those German speakers who you're talking about. You had the Brethren, who were called Dunkards sometimes because they had dunked people by they practiced adult baptism.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
So they dunked them in rivers and ponds and things like that. So you had those, and that whole they were called Anabaptists. So those whole people of Mennonite, Amish, Brethren, that whole group, and then you had some other German religious groups like the Lutheran group and the German Reformed, who were basically German Presbyterian. And those people they were German speaking, but there was no Germany as such then. So a lot of those, especially those Anabaptists, really came from what's now Switzerland. There were about 3 cantons in Switzerland that were German speaking, and they came out of a whole different movement. They weren't just discriminated against, they were persecuted and sometimes burned at the stake and things like that because of their religion, and they were pacifist as well. So you have both those groups, those German-speaking whole spectrum of groups, and then there's Presbyterians. They were in Pennsylvania and had been for a number of years and loved it. But a couple things happened in Pennsylvania. One is land became pretty expensive because as you started bringing in more people and settling down and having children and all, the land got gobbled up and became much more expensive. And so as they moved west in Pennsylvania, the Native Americans hadn't really left Pennsylvania, so they ran into conflict there. There was conflict right on the western border of Pennsylvania. So it becomes quite alluring to just follow that funnel that I talked about and just come right into the valley, up the valley essentially, because you're following the river. And a little known fact is that we have the law of gravity, and water flows downhill. So the Shenandoah River flows north. That means that if you go south in the valley, you're going uphill, because the headwaters of the Shenandoah are here in Augusta County.
It's all about altitude.
It's all about, yes. So they went up the valley, and it's easy because they just follow the river. They don't have to go over any mountains at all. They just follow the river. So they really wanted to come here and settle and make money and expand their fortunes in the New World. The problem was, remember, Pennsylvania was freedom of religion. They could be Presbyterian and build their churches. You could be Brethren and worship as you pleased. Not in Virginia. In Virginia, you had to be Anglican, and so there was. They wanted to come here. Virginia leaders wanted them to come here too to settle and provide that buffer. So there had to be some negotiations that happened. And Governor Gooch, who was the governor of Virginia at that time, what he did is he relaxed those religious toleration laws. He relaxed them and said, please come here. We want you to come here. We want you to settle. We want you to clear land and put up houses and make money because that protects us and fills up our economy. So they came in large numbers. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to relax those religious laws so that you still, when you create your parish and your county, you still got to build a courthouse, of course. You still got to elect a vestry. You still got to build a church. You got to hire a minister who's the parish priest, and he's a government official. But we're going to, wink, wink, we're going to let you build your Presbyterian places of worship. You got to call them meeting houses. We're going to let you marry your own people, bury your own people, but you still got to pay taxes to the church, and you still got to technically joined the church. So the floodgates were open, and all those Germans and those Presbyterians from the north of Ireland just started flooding in here and settled. And by, starting really in the 1720s, they just flowed in here. And a few people came over the mountains from the east, but they were in the minority very much. It was probably, depending on what part of the valley, if you go up to Winchester and Frederick County area, it's probably more heavily German. Then you get to Rockingham, and it's kind of mixed. And then that mix sort of starts changing to heavily Scotch-Irish by the time you get to Augusta County and Rockbridge. So by 1738, there were so many people here that it was and they were all technically in Orange County. They were all, because Orange County technically took in everything west of the Blue Ridge, even though Orange County today is east of the Blue Ridge. Right. So as they said, the leaders in Williamsburg said it's time to form new counties and simultaneously new parishes.
Well, let's expand. Yeah.
What's that?
Let's expand.
Yeah, let's expand. Let's get the tax money, right? So they formed two counties. These two giant counties. One was Augusta County, which was by far the biggest county, and it really took in. They carved them out of Orange County. So Augusta County was basically from the top of the Blue Ridge to the Mississippi River.
And you mean Front Royal-ish?
So the top of the Blue Ridge would be like where Albemarle County is.
I was thinking.
So the second county was Frederick County. Okay. And Frederick County was basically most of Shenandoah County, so New Market, Woodstock, and then north.
Right. So kind of where the Massanutten Ridge starts.
Right. No, about halfway up Massanutten, because Rockingham, what's now Rockingham and Page County were part of Augusta County.
Okay. Oh, I didn't realize that.
No. Mm-hmm. Rockingham and Page County were part of Augusta, and a little bit of Shenandoah County. And then once you get past that, so about half the Massanutten.
And you got to realize too that the West Virginia would have gone up into the Panhandle to Maryland. Yeah,
would have been all of West Virginia, of course, and West Virginia, like Hampshire County and Jefferson County, and those were part of Frederick. And Clark County was part of Frederick. Warren County was part of Frederick, and those. So the northern part of the valley and a chunk of West Virginia was Frederick County. So Frederick County was big, but Augusta County just then sort of took in all of Southwest Virginia, the rest of West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, a little bit of Michigan. So all of that was Augusta County.
Michigan.
Michigan. So basically to the Mississippi River. It was a huge county, and then they were named, of course, Augusta for Princess Augusta, who was the mother of King George III, who would figure into our. He's the guy that we had a little revolution against, and her husband Prince Frederick, who is the father of King George III.